The moment Clara Whitfield saw Hank Calloway's horse tied to her neighbor's fence post for the third Tuesday in a row, something inside her chest cracked clean in two, the way dry timber splits under a sharp axe in the dead of winter. She stood at the edge of her porch, one hand braced against the post she kept meaning to repaint, and watched the tall cowboy disappear through Dorothy Hale's front door with his hat held politely in both hands. The afternoon sun of late September 1879 cut long golden lines across the Oklahoma Territory, the kind of light that made everything look beautiful whether it deserved to be or not, and Clara decided right then that she was a fool. An absolute sun-baked Kansas dust fool. She turned and walked back inside her small homestead house, sat down at her kitchen table, and stared at the bowl of dried beans she was supposed to be sorting for supper. The beans blurred. She blinked hard and set her jaw. She was 23 years old. She had built this homestead alongside her father for 2 years before he died of a fever the previous spring, and she had kept it running on her own since then, which was no small thing for a woman alone on a 160-acre claim in the Cherokee Outlet. She had survived a drought, a snakebite on her left calf that had scared her half to death, and a roof collapse in February that had required her to sleep wrapped in every blanket she owned while she figured out how to patch it herself. She was not, she told herself firmly, the kind of woman who let a cowboy's smile undo her. But Hank Calloway's smile was a particular kind of devastation. She had met him 5 months ago in May, when he had ridden onto her property to ask if he could water his horse at her creek. He worked as a foreman for the Dalton Cattle Company, whose vast rangeland bordered both her property and Dorothy Hale's to the south. He had wide shoulders and dark eyes the color of creek water under storm clouds, and he had a way of listening to a person that made you feel like you were the only thing worth paying attention to in the whole territory. He had watered his horse, and then helped her repair a section of fence that had been giving her trouble for a week, and he had done it without being asked, and without making her feel like she needed to thank him excessively, which she respected enormously. After that, he had found reasons to pass by regularly. He brought her extra corn seed in June when he heard she was planting late. He fixed the hinge on her barn door in July without making a production of it. He sat with her on the porch one evening in August while a thunderstorm rolled across the flat land, and they had talked for 2 hours about everything from cattle prices to the books she kept on the small shelf above her fireplace. She had lent him a dog-eared copy of a novel she loved, and he had returned it the following week with a strip of leather marking a page, and said quietly that the part where the woman waits alone in the house, while everyone assumes she doesn't feel anything, had made him think. She had thought, foolishly, that maybe he was working up to something. But then the visits to Dorothy Hale had started. Dorothy was lovely in a way that required no effort. She was 26, a widow 3 years running, with flaxen hair and a laugh that carried across a field. Her farm was tidy and well-maintained because her late husband had left her with a small amount of savings and a farmhand who came twice a week. She was kind to Clara in that slightly pitying way that beautiful women sometimes were to ordinary women, bringing over jars of preserved peaches and asking if Clara was managing all right, alone as she was. Clara always said yes and meant it, but the peaches sometimes tasted like condescension. And now Hank Calloway was sitting in Dorothy Hale's parlor every Tuesday afternoon, and Clara was sitting at her kitchen table sorting beans and telling herself it didn't matter. It mattered. She pressed her fingertips hard against the table's surface and breathed out slowly. She was a practical woman. She understood that life in the Oklahoma Territory in 1879 was not a romantic novel, regardless of the one sitting on her shelf. Men married women who were established, who were settled, who had good land and fewer complications. Dorothy Hale had all of that. Clara had land, yes, but she also had debts she was still paying from her father's medical bills, and a reputation for being capable in the way that made men respectful but not romantic, and she wore her practicality on her like a second skin. She told herself that she would be fine. She sorted her beans. She made her supper. She went to bed before it was fully dark and lay there listening to the coyotes sing to each other across the flat and empty land. She was not fine, but she was functional. And in the Oklahoma Territory, functional was often the best anyone could hope for. The following Saturday, she drove her wagon into the town of Redfield, which was the nearest settlement of any consequence, 12 miles northwest of her homestead. Redfield was the kind of town that the territory was full of in those years, built up fast and rough on the promise of land and cattle money, with a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall, a small post office, a church that was also used for school 3 days a week, and a handful of other establishments. It had about 300 permanent residents and a constantly rotating population of cowboys, land speculators, and travelers passing through. Clara needed flour, lamp oil, and thread, and she needed to post a letter to her mother's sister in Missouri who had been asking after her since her father died. She tied her horse, a steady roan mare named Bess, outside the general store and went in with her list. The general store was run by a man named Preston Alt, who was 50-some years old and had opinions about everything. He greeted her with the warmth he reserved for regular paying customers and began pulling items from his shelves while she browsed the bolts of fabric near the window. She didn't need fabric, but she liked to look at it, the way she supposed some women like to look at jewelry. There was a bolt of deep blue cotton that she touched briefly with 2 fingers before reminding herself that she had perfectly serviceable dresses that were in no need of replacement. She was calculating the price of lamp oil against what she had in her purse when she became aware of a conversation happening between Preston Alt and another customer she couldn't see from behind the shelving unit. "Calloway's been riding out to see the Hale widow again," Preston was saying, in the tone of a man who enjoyed being the distribution point for all local information. "Is that right?" said the other voice, which Clara identified as belonging to Walt Greer, a rancher who lived north of town and was approximately as interested in other people's business as Preston Alt was. 3 weeks running, brought her flowers from what I hear. Yellow ones, wildflowers. Clara's hand tightened on the shelf. "Good man, Calloway," Walt Greer said. "Steady work, fair wage, no trouble. Dorothy Hale could do worse." "She could do considerable worse," Preston agreed. "Young woman alone on that land, she needs a solid man. Calloway's the foreman over at Dalton's, makes decent money. I'd say it's headed somewhere from the look of it." Clara set the lamp oil on the counter with a thud that was slightly more forceful than necessary, smoothed her expression into something neutral, and finished her shopping without further incident. She drove home under a sky that was turning colors she would have called beautiful on any other day, and told herself for the 100th time that it didn't matter. The following Tuesday she kept herself deliberately busy. She had been meaning to clear the far corner of her garden plot for fall planting, and she went at it with a hoe for most of the morning, with the kind of focused energy that had nothing to do with the fact that she was making sure she couldn't see Dorothy Hale's fence from where she was working. She was doing a fine job of it when she heard hoofbeats on the dirt track that ran alongside her property, and she looked up to see Hank Calloway riding past on his big gray horse, Soldier. He saw her and slowed. He raised his hat to her. "Morning, Clara," he called. "Morning," she called back and bent her head to the hoe again. She heard him pause as though he might say something more, and then the hoofbeats continued south, toward Dorothy Hale's property. Clara hoed a very precise row and did not watch him go. That evening she was sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold when she became aware that she had been staring at the horizon for 20 minutes thinking about nothing in particular, which was something she never did because she was always thinking about something, always running through the list of things that needed doing and planning and budgeting. She put the coffee cup down on the rail and said, out loud to the empty air, "Well, that settles it." And it was settled, she decided. She was going to stop thinking about Hank Calloway. He was courting Dorothy Hale. That was his right and Dorothy's right, and Clara was going to direct her considerable practical energies toward something more productive than hoping. She was good at deciding things. She was considerably less good at making her heart listen to what she decided. October came in dry and golden, and with it came the annual harvest festival that Redfield held every year in the open field behind the church. It was the biggest social event of the season in this part of the territory, drawing people from miles around, with food and music and a square dance that lasted until long after dark. Clara had not planned to go. She had a dozen reasons not to go, chief among them that social gatherings required a certain expenditure of emotional energy she wasn't sure she had to spare. But her neighbor on the north side, an elderly widow named Eugenia Cross, appeared at her door 2 days before the festival and informed her that she was going and that Clara was going to drive them both in the wagon, and that was the end of the matter. Eugenia Cross was 71 years old, had been in the territory since before it had been properly designated as territory, and had survived 3 husbands, 2 droughts, and 1 attempted raid on her homestead by a group of men who had made the significant error of underestimating an old woman with a shotgun. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall and regarded the world with the cheerful ferocity of someone who had decided a long time ago that life was going to be interesting whether she liked it or not. Clara liked her enormously. She agreed to drive them, put on her best dress, which was the green one that her mother had sent her 2 Christmases ago and which she had worn exactly 4 times, braided her dark hair and pinned it up, and told herself that she was going for Eugenia's sake and the fresh air and absolutely nothing else. The festival was already in full noise when they arrived. Lanterns had been strung on ropes between poles, and they cast a warm, swaying light over the crowd. There were tables loaded with food that everyone had contributed, pies and roasted meats and corn bread and pickles, and things preserved from summer's harvest. A fiddle and a guitar were already going in the corner, not quite yet playing a dancing tune but warming up toward one. Children ran in all directions with the frantic joy of children who have been cooped inside for the first cold weeks of autumn and are now suddenly, miraculously free. Eugenia immediately located 2 women her own age and disappeared into conversation with the ease of someone who has never in her life had trouble making herself at home anywhere. Clara loaded a plate with food she wasn't particularly hungry for, and found a spot near the edge of the gathering where she had a clear view of the lantern-lit crowd, and could therefore not be surprised by anything. She saw Dorothy Hale arrive 20 minutes later, wearing a lavender dress and looking like something off the cover of a periodical, with her fair hair done up in a style that must have taken some effort. She was accompanied by her farmhand, who kept a respectful distance, and she moved through the crowd accepting compliments and conversation with the ease of someone entirely comfortable being the most attractive person in any room. Clara watched her and felt a complicated mixture of things that she identified as envy, appreciation, and self-reproach, because she knew perfectly well that Dorothy Hale had done nothing wrong and had no idea that Clara had any feelings about Hank Calloway at all, and it was unkind to resent someone for simply being what they were. She was in the middle of this internal accounting when Hank Calloway appeared at her elbow. "Evening, Clara," he said. She startled enough that she nearly dropped her plate, which was embarrassing. She recovered quickly. "Evening," she said. "I didn't hear you coming." "I have a way of moving quietly," he said, and there was something in his tone that might have been amusement, though his expression was contained in the way it usually was. He had changed from his work clothes into a clean shirt, dark trousers, and his good hat, and he looked, against her will and better judgment, extremely fine. "Good crowd tonight," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I didn't know you were coming." "Eugenia Cross insisted on it," Clara said. "I believe she could have insisted a stone to move if she set her mind to it." The corner of his mouth lifted. "That's accurate." They stood together for a moment in the way that acquaintances sometimes did, filling space with comfortable enough silence. The fiddle had found its purpose and was now playing something lively, and several couples were moving into position for a square dance. "Are you dancing tonight?" Hank asked. Clara considered the question. "I hadn't planned to," she said honestly. "Would you plan to if someone asked you properly?" She looked at him. He was looking at the dancing couples, his profile lit warm from the lanterns, and his expression was entirely unreadable. She thought about Dorothy Hale in her lavender dress somewhere in this crowd, and thought about Tuesday afternoons and yellow wildflowers, and thought about Preston Alt's voice saying it's headed somewhere from the look of it. "I think I'd rather watch," she said. He nodded, as though she'd confirmed something, and moved off into the crowd. Clara watched him go and took a long, steadying breath and decided that she had handled that with remarkable composure, all things considered. She found Eugenia an hour later and drove them home under a sky absolutely extravagant with stars. And Eugenia talked the whole way about who she had seen and what they had said, and wasn't it a fine thing to have a gathering? And Clara said yes, and meant it, and managed not to think about brown eyes and lantern light for nearly 3 full minutes at a stretch. November arrived with its cold shoulder and its low gray skies, and Clara threw herself into winter preparations with the dedication of someone trying to exhaust a feeling out of themselves. She patched the roof properly, the job she had been meaning to do since the February collapse. She split firewood until her arms ached. She cleaned and organized everything that could be cleaned and organized, and she made a careful accounting of her finances, which were slowly improving, and she wrote long letters to her aunt in Missouri and shorter ones to her mother's oldest friend in Kansas, and she read every book on her shelf twice. She did not ride south past Dorothy Hale's farm. She did not look for a gray horse on the track. She told herself, making progress. And then one cold morning in the second week of November, she drove to Redfield for supplies and ran into Margaret Fenwick, who was one of those women who cannot deliver interesting news without first creating maximum suspense around it, and who greeted Clara outside the post office with the particular bright-eyed energy of someone holding something they cannot wait to release. "Have you heard?" Margaret said. Clara had not heard anything because she had been largely avoiding people, but she said, "Heard what?" because there was no graceful alternative. "About Dorothy Hale and Hank Calloway," Margaret said, and paused for maximum effect. Clara's stomach did something unfortunate. "No," she said neutrally. "He's been going to her house to ask about buying a piece of land," Margaret said, "not courting her at all. I heard it from Dorothy herself this morning. She said he'd been talking to her about whether she'd consider selling the south quarter of her claim, because the Dalton Company wants to expand their grazing boundary, and they asked Hank to negotiate privately. She said she thought he was sweet on her at first too, but then he finally made it plain it was business, and she laughed about it because she said she'd been wearing her good dress every Tuesday for a month for nothing." Clara stared at her. "Isn't that funny?" Margaret said. "Yes," Clara said very carefully. "That is something." She finished her errands in a state of slightly surreal calm, drove home at a pace that Bess found surprisingly brisk for a cold November morning, and sat down at her kitchen table and thought very hard about the difference between what she had believed and what was apparently true. He had not been courting Dorothy Hale. He had been conducting business. She sat with this information for a long time, turning it over the way you might turn over a stone to see what was underneath it, examining it from different angles, trying to determine what, if anything, it changed. It changed the fact of Dorothy, certainly. But it didn't necessarily change anything about Hank Calloway and Clara Whitfield, because nothing had ever been said between them, and a man conducting business at a neighbor's farm was not the same as a man declaring intentions toward the woman on the other side of the road, and she would be foolish to assume otherwise. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats. She looked out her window and saw nothing on the track, which was unusual, because hoofbeats in this part of the territory generally meant someone on the track, and then she heard the hoofbeats come around to her yard, and she went to the door. Hank Calloway was riding into her yard at a pace that was faster than his usual, and when he pulled Soldier to a stop and dismounted, she could see that the horse was breathing hard, really hard, the kind of hard that meant they had come a long distance at speed. She stepped out onto the porch. "What's wrong?" she said immediately, because a man who arrives on a hard-ridden horse generally has something urgent to say. He took his hat off. He was breathing harder than usual himself, a flush of cold and exertion in his face, and his dark eyes were very direct when they found hers. He stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her, and then he said, without preamble, the way he usually did, because he was not a man who wasted words or time, "I've been to Dorothy Hale's house every Tuesday for the past 6 weeks on Dalton Company business, trying to negotiate a land purchase. I heard in town today that people think I've been courting her. I need you to know that isn't what it was. I need you to know that because I think you believe it too, and I'd rather ride 12 miles to tell you the truth than let it sit wrong between us another day." Clara stared at him. He had ridden from the Dalton Company's main range, which was 12 miles east. She could see it in the state of the horse, in the cold reddened line of his jaw, in the way he was standing at the foot of her porch steps holding his hat and looking at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through. "You rode 12 miles, she said. "I did," he said, "to tell me that." "To tell you that," he confirmed. "And to tell you something else if you'll hear it." She came down one step. "I'll hear it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him assembling the words with the same care he brought to everything he did, the careful, deliberate way he approached a problem. "I have been paying attention to you since May," he said. "I have been finding reasons to be on this stretch of road since May. I brought corn seed and I fixed a hinge, and I sat on your porch in a thunderstorm and talked to you about books, and I have been trying to work out the right way to say that none of those things were incidental." He paused. "I'm not a man who talks around a thing, so I won't. I think about you considerably more than I think about anything else, and if you have any interest in letting me come calling properly, I would very much like to do that." The wind came across the flat land and moved the bare branches of the cottonwood at the edge of her yard. Somewhere far off, a hawk called once and was gone. Clara looked at this man standing at the foot of her steps in the cold November air, who had ridden 12 miles at a pace that had put lather on his horse, to make sure she knew the truth, and she thought that she had spent 6 weeks being miserable on the basis of an assumption, and that was 6 weeks she would very much like to have back, except that they had brought her to this moment, so perhaps they were worth it after all. "You lent back my book," she said. He looked slightly uncertain, as though he couldn't tell where she was going. "I did," he said. "You marked a page. The part about the woman who waits alone and everyone assumes she doesn't feel anything." "Yes," he said. "I thought that was about me," she said. "When I read what you had marked, I thought you were telling me something." Something moved across his face, something warm and a little undone. "I was," he said quietly. "I was trying to tell you something. I was apparently not as clear about it as I thought I was." "No," she said, and she could feel the smile coming up through her despite her best efforts to be dignified about it. "You were not." "I'm being clear now," he said. "You are," she agreed. She came down the last step, so she was standing on the ground in front of him, the cold air sharp between them, and she looked up at him and said, "Yes, you may come calling properly." The expression that came over his face at that was the kind of expression that a person carries with them for years afterward, the kind that you can call up perfectly in memory no matter how much time passes, because it is the look of someone who genuinely wasn't certain what the answer would be and has just received the answer they hoped for. It was unguarded and warm and entirely without pretense, and Clara decided in that moment that whatever came next, she was glad she had been brave enough to say yes. "Good," he said, and his voice was a little rougher than usual. "That's good. Come inside," she said. "You rode 12 miles in November. I'll make coffee." He tied Soldier to the post and came inside, and she made coffee on the small iron stove, and they sat at her kitchen table and talked for 2 hours in the way they had that August evening on the porch during the thunderstorm, except that this time both of them knew what they were saying underneath what they were saying, and that changed the quality of everything considerably. He told her about growing up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had worked himself to the bone on a small spread near San Antonio. He had learned to ride before he could properly walk, had been driving cattle north on the trail by the time he was 17, and had worked his way up to foreman at the Dalton Company over 6 years of consistent, honest work. He was 28 years old. He owned very little except his horse, his gear, and a modest amount of savings, and he had been thinking seriously for the past year about whether the life of a foreman on someone else's land was what he wanted indefinitely, or whether there was something else he might build for himself. Clara told him about the homestead, about coming out with her father from Kansas in 1877, when the land claim opportunity had opened up, about the 2 years they had built the place together, and the spring when he had died, and she had looked at the unfinished work and the unplanted fields, and decided that the worst thing she could do was quit. She told him about the debts straightforwardly, because she was not a woman who hid difficult truths, and she told him that they were manageable and getting smaller. She told him about her garden and her animals, which were 2 milk cows and Bess, and a collection of chickens with personalities she had long since given up pretending were not distinct. He laughed at the chickens. It was a good laugh, full and uncomplicated. He came back the following Sunday, which was 4 days later, and stayed for most of the afternoon. He helped her with a section of fence that needed attention, and they walked the perimeter of her property together in the cold air while she told him what she had planted where and what she planned for the following spring, and he listened with the focused attention that was particular to him. He had opinions about planting rotation that were sensible and practical, and she incorporated 2 of them into her thinking on the spot, which she told him directly, and the look of quiet pleasure that crossed his face was something she stored carefully away. He came back the Sunday after that, and the one after that. December arrived, and the cold descended properly, and he brought her a cord of extra firewood that he had split himself and stacked by her barn without making it feel like charity, which was a difficult thing to manage, and which she appreciated more than she said. She made him dinner that evening, a proper Sunday dinner with roasted chicken and corn bread and the last of her preserved green beans from summer, and they ate at her table and talked until the fire burned low, and when he finally stood to go he lingered at the door for a moment in the lamplight and looked at her with that direct, steady gaze. "I'm glad I rode out here in November," he said. "I'm glad you did too," she said. He put his hat on, and then he paused and reached out and touched her face briefly with one hand, just his fingertips along her jaw, so careful and deliberate and warm that she felt it all the way down to her boots. And then he was out the door and mounting his horse and riding off into the December dark, and she stood in her doorway watching until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. She closed the door and stood in her own kitchen smiling at the wall like an absolute fool, and for once she didn't tell herself to stop. He kissed her for the first time on the 22nd of December, which was also the day that the first real snow of the season came down out of the north and turned the Oklahoma Territory into something that looked briefly, improbably like a painting. He had come to help her check on the animals in advance of the coming cold, and they had been out to the barn and back and stamped the snow from their boots on the porch, and she had pushed the door open and turned to say something to him about whether the smaller of the 2 cows was going to be all right in the cold, and he was standing very close because the porch was small and they had both been moving toward the door, and whatever she had been about to say about the cow did not get said. He asked, quietly, "May I?" And she said yes, and he kissed her in the doorway of her house with the snow coming down behind him and the lamplight coming out past her from inside. And it was the kind of kiss that was both exactly what she had imagined and nothing like what she had imagined, gentle and warm and entirely certain of itself. And when it ended, she stood there for a moment with her eyes still closed, and decided that 6 weeks of misery had been a very small price to pay for this specific moment. "Come inside," she finally said. "It's snowing." "I noticed," he said, and came in. Christmas in the Oklahoma Territory in 1879 was a modest affair by most measures, but Clara had never needed lavishness to find joy in things. She spent Christmas Day with Eugenia Cross, who had invited both her and Hank to dinner with the calm authority of someone who sees what is happening before the people involved have fully articulated it to themselves. Eugenia cooked an extraordinary amount of food for a woman of her size, and told stories about the early territory days that were alternately hilarious and harrowing, and watched Hank and Clara with the satisfied expression of someone whose instincts have been confirmed. When they left that evening, walking to the wagon in the cold, clear air, Hank tucked Clara's hand through his arm with a naturalness that made her realize he had stopped being careful about it, that it had simply become the thing they did, and she thought that there was something very particular about the moment when comfort settles between two people, when the deliberateness softens into habit. January was hard, as January always was, but it was different that year. He came every Sunday without fail, and sometimes on a Wednesday if work permitted, and they wrote each other letters on the days between, which was something she had not expected, and which undid her completely the first time a letter appeared in her hands written in his plain, direct handwriting. He wrote the way he talked, without flourish, but there was a precision to the words that she found more moving than any amount of elaborate sentiment would have been. He said what he meant. He always said what he meant. She wrote back at length, because writing was something she had always been good at and had never had quite the right person to write to. And he told her that her letters were the best thing that happened to him in any given week, which was a statement that she read 3 times, and then folded into the small box she kept on her shelf, where she had always kept the things that mattered most. February brought a week of brutal cold that kept everyone close to their fires, and on the first Sunday that was passable enough to ride, Hank came out and found her in the barn with the smaller of the 2 cows, which had finally decided that the cold was too much and had gone off her feed. He rolled up his sleeves in the cold barn and helped her for 3 hours until the cow was eating again, and the situation was stabilized. And by the end of it they were both tired and cold, and laughing at something entirely stupid that she couldn't later remember. And she looked at him in the dim barn light with the smell of hay and cold animals around them and thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its completeness, that she was in love with him. Not in the giddy, panicked way of someone who has just discovered a feeling, in the settled, certain way of someone who has been feeling something for a while and has finally found the word for it. It fit as neatly as a key in a lock, and it didn't frighten her. She didn't say it yet. She wasn't ready yet, and she was a woman who believed in the appropriate timing of things. But she carried it around with her from that day forward, warm and solid, like a coal in a pocket on a cold day. Spring came with a rush, the way it did in the territory, going from brown and gray to green almost overnight, and with it came the energy and the work of a new planting season. Clara was in her garden 3 days after the ground was workable, and Hank helped on the weekends with the heavier work, and they fell into a rhythm together that was so easy and natural that she sometimes forgot it was only in its first months, because it felt considerably older and more established than that. It was an April evening, sitting on her porch after a long day of planting, with the light going golden and the smell of turned earth in the air, and Hank sitting in the other chair with his boots off and his long legs stretched out, that she told him. She had not planned to say it that particular evening. It simply arrived at the front of her with the force of something that has been waiting patiently for the right moment and has decided this is it. "I love you," she said, in the middle of a conversation about whether the West Field was getting enough drainage, and it came out perfectly calm and direct, which was consistent with her general approach to things. He turned to look at her. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not quite seen on him before, something that was full and a little overwhelmed and entirely without his usual containment. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I just thought you should know because I think you already do know, or I suspect you do, but I'd rather have said it plainly." "I love you," he said. "I have for some time. I was working out when the right moment was." "This is the right moment," she said. "I see that now," he said. He reached across the gap between their chairs and took her hand, and they sat there as the sun went down over the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1880, holding hands on her porch with the smell of turned earth and the sound of frogs starting up by the creek. And it was not a dramatic moment by any external measure, but it was one of the finest moments of her life, and she knew it then, recognized it clearly even as it was happening, which she thought was a great gift. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between them in the way that things shift after a truth has been spoken. There was less deliberateness, less caution, more of the easy warmth that had always been possible between them but had been held in a certain careful suspension. He brought her things, small things, a packet of seeds she had mentioned wanting, a book from the town's small lending library, a ribbon she had admired in the general store window without saying anything aloud, which meant he had noticed her look and then gone back for it. And that detail alone was enough to make her put the ribbon down and take a breath before she could properly thank him for it. She cooked for him with increasing confidence and pleasure, discovering that feeding someone you love is a particular kind of expression, and she was good at it. And he ate everything she put in front of him with an appreciation that was genuine and uncomplicated, and made the cooking worthwhile. And then one evening in June, 6 weeks after the porch conversation, he came to dinner on a Sunday, and after the meal was finished and cleared away and they were sitting with their coffee, he became quieter than usual. She noticed it the way she had learned to notice his silences, which were usually purposeful. He was thinking about something specific. She let the quiet run. She was not a woman who filled silence nervously. Finally, he set his cup down and said, "I have been doing a great deal of thinking." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew." "For about an hour," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been talking to the Dalton Company," he said. "They've made me an offer. They want me to take on the management of the northern section of the range, the part that borders your land, and they're offering a small house on that land as part of the arrangement. It would be a permanent position, better pay, and it would put me 3 miles from where I'm sitting right now instead of 12. "That sounds like a good offer," Clara said carefully, because she could hear that there was more. "It is," he said, "but I find I'm not primarily thinking about it in terms of the job." He looked at her directly. "I find I'm thinking about it in terms of 3 miles from you rather than 12, and whether 3 miles is still too far." She looked back at him. "It might be," she said. He nodded slowly. He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the table between them. It was a ring, small and plain and gold, the kind of ring that a man buys in a territory town from a general store that carries a modest selection, and it was not elaborate or impressive by any grand measure, but it was there on her kitchen table, and the fact that he had been carrying it in his shirt pocket spoke for itself. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. I know I'm asking with less to offer than a woman of your quality deserves, and I know this homestead is yours and that it represents years of work that belong to you, and I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm asking to be part of it, to work beside you on it, to build something here that's ours rather than just one or the other." He paused. "I have been thinking about this for several months, and I believe I'm thinking about it clearly, and I would very much like to know what you think." Clara looked at the ring on her kitchen table. She looked at the man across from her, who had ridden 12 miles in November to tell her the truth, who wrote letters in plain, precise handwriting, who fixed her fence and split her wood and sat with her in thunderstorms and marked a page in her book to tell her something he hadn't yet found the direct words for, who had just asked her to marry him with such clear-eyed honesty that there was not a single word of it she didn't believe entirely. "Yes," she said, "I think that very clearly." He picked up the ring and came around the table and took her hand and put it on her finger. And it fit, which seemed important, which seemed like one of those things that you couldn't plan for, and that meant something precisely because of that. She stood up from her chair and put her arms around him, and he held her in the middle of her kitchen with his face in her hair, and she could feel the tension in him release, the careful, controlled tension that was simply how he moved through the world, and in its place was something warm and open that she thought she might spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of. They were married in August, in the church in Redfield that also served as the school 3 days a week, with most of the town in attendance because news travels fast in a small settlement, and everyone has an opinion about a good match. Eugenia Cross sat in the front row and cried without making any apology for it, and Margaret Fenwick was there with her husband and reported later to anyone who asked that it was the loveliest wedding she had attended in the territory, which was saying something because she had attended 17. Dorothy Hale came and brought a very nice crock of preserved peaches that Clara was able to accept this time with complete and uncomplicated gratitude. Clara wore the green dress because it was the best she had, and she put the blue ribbon he had bought her in her hair, and she walked down the short aisle of the small church with her chin up and her eyes clear, and her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness, and everything to do with the fact that he was standing at the front of the church watching her come toward him with an expression on his face that she was going to carry for the rest of her life. Hank Calloway accepted the Dalton Company's offer and took up the position managing the northern section, and the small house on the range became their second home in a loose sense, a place where he stayed when the work required it. But their primary home was Clara's homestead, which they had agreed on without much discussion, because it was where the established garden was, where the cows were, where she had built something out of hard work and will. And because he had meant it when he said he wanted to be part of it rather than replace it. He turned out to be a considerable asset to the homestead, not because he took it over, because he didn't and made a point of not doing so, but because there were things that had simply been beyond the scope of what one person could manage alone. A second well that they dug in the fall that made the dry summers more bearable, an addition to the barn that gave the animals proper shelter, a new chicken coop built to specifications that satisfied even the most opinionated of the chickens. She became, in turn, a considerable asset to him, in ways he had not entirely anticipated. She had a facility with numbers and accounts that was sharper than his, and she began managing the financial records for both the homestead and his work with the Dalton Company, a task she took to with the same organized precision she brought to everything. She also had a way of reading people that was quiet and accurate, and more than once her assessment of a situation or a person proved to be the correct one when he had been uncertain. They were well matched. They had always been well matched. The preceding months had simply been the time required to establish the fact. Their first winter as a married couple was the kind of winter that the territory occasionally produced as though to test everyone's resolve. A long, brutal cold season with 2 separate blizzards, and a stretch in January that kept them inside for 4 days together, which they spent productively and also very happily, because being snowed in with the right person turns out to be one of the better situations life can present you with. They played cards and read aloud to each other and cooked elaborate meals because there was nothing else to do, and talked at length about everything under a roof they couldn't leave. And by the time the snow released them, they knew each other more thoroughly than most people manage in years. The following spring, in April of 1881, Clara told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the same direct way she told him everything, sitting at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning before he left for the range, simply looking up from her coffee and saying, "I believe we are going to have a child in the fall." He put his coffee cup down very carefully, and then he looked at her with that expression she had first seen on her porch in November, the unguarded warmth that came out when something genuinely moved him. "Are you well? was the first thing he said, which she had expected would be his first question, because it was entirely in keeping with his character. "I am very well," she said, "strong as anything. I don't intend to slow down until I'm forced to." "I know you don't," he said, and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and looked at her with a look that made it very difficult to be composed. "We're going to have a child," he said, as though saying it aloud was the way to make it fully real. "We are," she confirmed. He was late to the range that morning, which was notable because he was never late to anything. She watched him ride out and put her hand over her middle and felt, for the first time in her life, that the word abundance applied to her in some meaningful way. She did not slow down until she was forced to, which was not until September, when the size of her made certain tasks impractical. By then she had finished the fall planting, overseen the repair of the south-facing fence, put up more preserved vegetables than they could possibly eat in a winter, and completed a quilt she had been working on since the previous January. Hank, for his part, found 17 different subtle ways to be helpful without making her feel managed, which was a delicate line to walk, and which he managed with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Their son was born on the 17th of October, 1881, during a thunderstorm that rolled across the territory in the early hours of the morning, which felt appropriate to Clara, who had always liked storms. Eugenia Cross was there, and the town's doctor, a reliable man named Hargrove who had come out from Redfield at a pace that spoke well of his dedication. Hank was in the room because Clara had looked at him when the labor started and said, "I would like you here," in a tone that made it clear this was not up for discussion, and so he was there, holding her hand and being steady in the way he was always steady. And when the baby arrived and was placed in her arms, red-faced and outraged and entirely perfect, she looked up at him and saw that he was not, in fact, as steady as usual, because there were tears on his face, which she had never seen before and which she found she would need a moment to fully absorb. They named him Robert James Calloway, James for her father. Robert James was a loud and healthy baby with dark eyes like his father and a stubborn streak that, as Eugenia Cross observed with some amusement, he could have gotten from either of his parents. He grew fast, the way healthy babies do, and the homestead reorganized itself around his presence with the adaptability of a place that had already survived a great deal and could accommodate one small and very determined person. Hank was a natural father in the way that might have surprised people who didn't know him well, because he had a patience and a steadiness that translated seamlessly to the demands of a child. He held Robert in the evenings with an ease that Clara had to remind herself not to stand and watch at length, because it was the kind of sight that could undo a person. He talked to the baby the way he talked to everyone, directly and without babying the words, which the baby seemed to appreciate based on the attentive look he always directed at his father's face. The years settled into their shape. The homestead grew and improved, season by season, as two people working together could improve a thing that one had been slowly managing alone. They added another field in the spring of 1882 and diversified what they planted based on what the market in Redfield would support, and Clara's careful accounting made the difference between guessing and knowing what that margin was. Hank's work with the Dalton Company was excellent, and his reputation in the territory was of the best kind, the kind that spreads quietly among people who pay attention to character. They were part of the community in Redfield in a way that felt earned. They attended the annual Harvest Festival, and the church services when the weather was reasonable, and the town meetings that were held periodically as the territory worked toward the statehood that was still some years away but clearly coming. Hank served one term on the small citizens committee that helped to mediate land disputes in the area, because he was trusted by people on all sides of most disagreements, which was not a common thing and was therefore valuable. Clara began keeping bees in the spring of 1883, which was something she had been thinking about since she first planted the orchard trees the previous fall, and understood that pollination was going to be the question. She got the hives from a man in Redfield who was retiring from beekeeping and sold her 3 established hives at a fair price, and she learned the management of them with the same careful, methodical approach she brought to everything new, reading everything she could find on the subject and asking questions of everyone with relevant experience. By the fall of 1883, she was producing enough honey to sell the surplus, which was a modest but satisfying additional income. Robert, at 2 years old, was fascinated by the bees in the way that small children are fascinated by dangerous things, and managing his proximity to the hives became a daily exercise in redirection that Hank said was excellent preparation for cattle management, because the principles were similar. Their second child, a daughter they named Frances Ellen, arrived in the spring of 1884, and unlike her brother, she came into the world with a calm that immediately distinguished her from everything around her. She was a quiet, watchful baby who seemed to be taking extensive notes on her environment from the very beginning, and who grew into a quiet, watchful child who periodically delivered observations of such accuracy that both her parents found themselves looking at each other in startled amusement. Robert, for his part, was by now a toddler of tremendous physical energy and goodwill, who regarded his new sister with protective enthusiasm that required some management in the early months, but settled into a genuine tenderness that Clara thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen develop. The homestead at this point had grown into something considerably more than what her father had imagined when they had staked the claim in 1877. The house had been expanded twice, carefully, room by room as the need arose and the means allowed. The barn was solid and well-maintained. The garden was a point of genuine pride, not just for what it produced but for how it was organized, which reflected Clara's particular mind applied to soil and seed, and weather with 7 years of accumulated knowledge. The orchard trees were beginning to bear properly, the honey operation was established, and the account book that Clara kept in the drawer of her desk showed a positive balance that had been consistently positive for 3 years. It was not a grand fortune. It was a real one, built out of real work and real decisions made with good information and no illusions. Clara thought her father would have recognized it and been satisfied, and that satisfaction, imagined and therefore internal, was something she returned to sometimes when she needed steadying. There was an afternoon in the fall of 1884, one of those October afternoons that the territory did particularly well, when the sky was the specific shade of blue that only exists in autumn, and the cottonwood leaves had gone yellow, and the air had that edge of cold in it that made everything feel slightly more vivid, as though the world had been sharpened. Clara was standing at the edge of her garden looking over what remained of the season's planting, Robert beside her chattering about something she was half listening to, and Frances on her hip looking at the cottonwood leaves with her usual contemplative expression. Hank came out from the barn and walked across the yard toward them, and he stopped a little distance away and looked at the 3 of them with that look she had never quite been able to fully describe to herself. That particular look that had been on his face the first time he had held Robert, and in various forms ever since, that was about recognition and gratitude and something that didn't have a simple word, but was larger than any of the words she might have applied to it. She looked back at him, standing in the October light, and thought about November of 1879, which was 5 years ago, and the man who had ridden 12 miles on a hard-breathing horse to tell her the truth. She thought about how easy it would have been for him not to, how easy it would have been to let her assumption stand, to let the misunderstanding simply continue until it resolved itself one way or another. A lesser man might have done that, a man less committed to honesty, less certain that what was between them was worth 12 miles in the cold. She had thought about those 12 miles many times since. She thought that they were the measure of something, those 12 miles. A man's willingness to cross a distance for the sake of truth, for the sake of a woman he hoped might be willing to hear it. She walked toward him across the yard, Robert running ahead of her, Frances content on her hip, and when she reached him she stopped close and looked up at him. "What are you thinking about?" he said. 12 miles, she said. He understood immediately, as he usually did. Something moved in his eyes. "Worth every one," he said. "Yes," she agreed. It was. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the October afternoon, while Robert executed a complicated experiment involving sticks and the soil at the edge of the garden, and Frances continued her study of the yellow leaves. And the sky was that particular autumn blue, and the smell of the land around them was the smell that had become over these years the smell of home. The smell she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life as the smell of where she belonged and what she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. The years continued to unfold with the reliable generosity of years that are built on good foundations. Eugenia Cross, who had declined in health slowly but stubbornly over the winter of 1885, died in the early spring, and her passing left a space in the fabric of things that Clara felt every day. She had been like a grandmother to both children, the kind who told stories that were sometimes questionable in their content but always extraordinary in their delivery. And Robert in particular was inconsolable for 2 weeks, which Clara thought was the right response to losing someone like that. Eugenia had left the homestead to a nephew in Missouri, who came, looked at the Oklahoma territory with the expression of someone who had been expecting something entirely different, and sold the property to a young couple from Kansas who were friendly and hardworking, and who Clara was glad to have as neighbors, even if they were not Eugenia. Robert started school in the fall of 1887, which meant the twice-weekly ride into Redfield, and he did so with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting to be old enough to do a thing and is finally old enough to do it. He was quick with arithmetic, which pleased Clara, and less quick with sitting still, which pleased no one but which his teacher managed with the patient expertise of someone who had been educating territory children for 15 years and had seen everything. Frances, who would start school the following year, was meanwhile conducting her own education in the way she always did, through observation and question, and the kind of quiet persistence that produced results without anyone quite noticing how or when. By the age of 4, she could identify every plant in her mother's garden by name, and most of them by use, which she had absorbed through proximity and attention without being explicitly taught, and she had a calmness with the bees that Clara was initially alarmed by, and then, upon reflection, recognized as a genuine aptitude. It was in the fall of 1887 that Hank came home from the Dalton Company's main office with something in his expression that she read correctly before he had said a word. She was at the kitchen table reviewing the account book, and she looked up, and he sat down across from her, and she closed the account book and said, "Tell me," he told her. The Dalton Company was consolidating its operations, moving the center of its management to its southern holdings, which meant that the northern section, Hank's section, was going to be reduced and eventually folded into the broader management structure. His position would be changed significantly. It was not exactly losing his job, but it was close enough that the distinction was largely technical. "How do you feel about it?" Clara said. He was quiet for a moment, which meant he was looking at the truth of it before speaking it. "I think," he said finally, "that I have been working for someone else's land for 15 years, and I think that I would like at some point to be working on our own." She looked at him across the table, her practical mind already moving through possibilities. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. What he was thinking was this: the north quarter of the Hale property, the piece that the Dalton Company had ultimately decided not to buy from Dorothy Hale 3 years prior when she had reconsidered the sale, had come on the market again. Dorothy Hale had remarried and moved to Kansas with her new husband, and the property was being managed by an agent who had been advertising the sale for 6 months without success, because it was a significant piece of land at a significant price. But it was good land, adjoining the Callaway homestead's north boundary, and with their savings and a reasonable loan from the Redfield Bank, which had been doing business with them for 7 years and had an excellent record of their reliability, it was conceivable. It was not a small risk. They sat up late that night going through the numbers together, Clara with the account book open and her pencil moving, Hank laying out what the land could be used for and how quickly and at what cost. They went over it 3 times, from 3 different angles, considering the worst cases alongside the best ones, because they were both people who believed in looking directly at the difficult versions of things. By midnight they had an answer that satisfied both of them, which was, yes, with care. They made the purchase in November of 1887, which was, Clara noted to Hank with some amusement, 8 years after that November when he had ridden 12 miles to her door. He laughed and said that November was apparently a good month for significant events in their life, and she agreed that it seemed to be. The expansion of the land required more hands than just the 2 of them, and Hank hired 2 men to help with the work, both of them young and capable, and the kind of employees that Hank's reputation attracted, which was to say reliable and honest ones. He managed them the way he managed everything, with clear expectation and fair treatment, and the kind of steady authority that doesn't need to make itself known loudly because it is simply felt. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was one of the hardest winters the territory had seen in years, the kind of winter that tested everything and everyone, and they were glad of their preparations, glad of the second well, glad of the expanded barn, glad of the careful accounting that had left them with reserves sufficient to carry through a hard season without panic. The hired men were housed in the small structure they had built for that purpose on the north end of the property, and Hank made sure they were provisioned, which was both a practical and a decent thing to do, and which Clara appreciated on both counts. Spring broke late that year and came in hard and fast, the way it sometimes did, and the rush of work that followed was the most demanding they had faced, planting the new acreage alongside maintaining the established homestead. Clara, at 32, found that she had the stamina for it without difficulty, and that the children, Robert now 7 and Francis 6, were old enough to be genuinely helpful in ways that were not simply symbolic. Robert could handle Bess in the yard and perform real useful tasks, and Francis applied herself to the garden with a focused competence that was remarkable. By the harvest of 1888, it was clear that the expansion had been the right decision. The North Quarter produced well in its first proper planting season. The cattle operation that Hank established on the new acreage was small but solid, and the combined income of the farm and the honey and the cattle was enough to make Clara's account book show something that she could only describe as security, real and genuine, and built on 8 years of work and decision and partnership. She sat with the account book one evening in October of 1888, going over the harvest figures, and she found herself sitting back in her chair and looking at the numbers for a long moment before she closed the book and went to find Hank. He was on the porch in his usual evening chair, looking out at the land in the last of the day's light. She came out and sat beside him in her chair, and they were quiet for a moment, looking at the same thing. "We're all right," she said. "We are," he said. "More than all right." "Considerably," he agreed. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand the way she had in 100 evenings on this porch over these years, and he turned his hand over and held hers properly, the way he always did. "I think my father would have liked you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "He was a practical man who said what he meant and meant what he said," she said. "He would have liked you immediately and approved of you eventually, once he saw how the account book looked." Hank laughed, a full, warm sound. "In that order, he was a thorough man," Clara said. "He liked to be certain." "I understand that," Hank said. "I know you do," she said. It's one of the things I love about you." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. Then he said, "I think sometimes about that November, about riding out here." "I know," she said. "I do too." "I was not certain what you would say," he said. "I was fairly certain you had spent 6 weeks thinking I was pursuing Dorothy Hale, and I was not entirely certain that 6 weeks of that thought hadn't closed a door that might have been open." "It hadn't," she said. "No," he said, "but I didn't know that until you told me, and I would not have known it if I hadn't ridden out." "No," she agreed. "That's the part I think about most," he said. "How close it was to not happening. How different everything is because I decided to ride." Clara looked at the land in front of them, her land and now their land. The garden and the orchard and the barn and the bees and the chickens, whose personalities were still distinct and still acknowledged. And the house behind them that had started as one thing and become something larger. And the 2 children who were inside doing whatever they did in the evenings after dinner, which currently involved a significant amount of reading in Robert's case, and in Francis's case a project whose nature was always somewhat mysterious and whose results were always interesting. "I'm glad you decided to ride," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." They sat there as the sky went from gold to pink to the deep blue of early evening, and the coyotes started their nightly conversation across the flat land, and the first stars appeared, and the October air had that cold, clean edge that meant frost before morning and the end of another growing season, and she thought that she was, without qualification or reservation, happy. The kind of happy that is not a single emotion but a whole condition of life. The kind that is built out of the accumulation of ordinary days that are good. The kind that is made possible by knowing where you are and who you are with, and that both of those things are exactly right. Robert came to the door and reported that he had finished his reading, and was there anything that needed doing, in the tone of someone who hopes the answer is no. And Hank told him the chickens needed checking before full dark. And Robert accepted this with the resigned goodwill of a child who knows resistance is futile and went to do it. Frances appeared beside him briefly in the doorway, looked at her parents sitting in their chairs in the evening air holding hands, and said, in her characteristic observational manner, "You are doing that thing again," and went back inside without further comment. "What thing?" Hank called after her. "The sitting thing," Frances called back. "You do it every evening." "Every evening," Clara said. "Like clockwork," Frances confirmed and was gone. Hank looked at Clara. Clara looked at Hank. And they both laughed at the same time there on the porch in the October evening, laughed in the full-bodied way of people who are genuinely delighted, and the sound of it went out across the yard and the land beyond it into the dark coming October air of the Oklahoma Territory. And it was a fine sound, and it belonged there, and so did they. The years ahead would bring their share of ordinary difficulties and unexpected joys, as years always do, as life in the territory had always taught them to expect. There would be a dry summer in 1889 that tested the cattle operation and required careful management of water resources, which Clara handled with the strategic precision that had become her particular gift. There would be the territory's movement toward statehood, still nearly 20 years in the future, but already beginning to change the shape of things, bringing new people and new enterprise and new complications to land that had been raw and open when Clara and her father had first staked their claim. Robert would grow into a young man with his mother's head for numbers and his father's steadiness, who would decide at 16 that he wanted to study engineering in Kansas City, a decision his parents supported completely and helped him pursue, because they believed in choosing the life that fit you rather than the one that was simply available. Frances would develop her quiet gifts in directions that surprised everyone and surprised no one, becoming by her teens an authority on local plant life, who was consulted regularly by people twice and 3 times her age, and who would eventually write a modest but well-regarded guide to native Oklahoma Territory plants that would be published in 1898, and of which her mother would be extravagantly proud. But those were futures that would arrive in their time, as futures do. On that October evening of 1888, on the porch of the homestead that had been built out of hard work and will, and the love of a woman for her land, and a man's willingness to ride 12 miles in the cold to tell her the truth, it was enough to be sitting here, in the good specific now of their life, which was built and was solid and was theirs. Clara Calloway looked at the stars beginning to appear above the Oklahoma territory, felt the warmth of her husband's hand in hers, listened to the sound of her son's voice talking to the chickens in the yard with the weary patience of someone who considers chicken management beneath his dignity but does it anyway, and thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago sitting at a kitchen table sorting beans and telling herself it didn't matter. It had mattered. All of it had mattered. Every bit of misunderstanding, and every Tuesday she had assumed wrongly, and every moment she had stood on her porch watching a gray horse go south down the track. It had all mattered, and it had all been part of the getting here. She squeezed Hank's hand once. He squeezed back without looking because he always knew. The stars filled in above the territory, and the coyotes sang, and the night came down around the Calloway homestead in the way that nights do when the day has been good, and the people in it are where they are supposed to be, quietly, completely, with the certainty of something that is simply true, the way the land is true, the way water is true, the way a 12-mile ride on a cold November morning is true and worth every one of the miles.